Hey. Hello, and welcome back to Night Shift with Andrea Up Late. Happy Tuesday, everybody. How you doing, co-host Brian Sanders?
I am really, really good now.
Are you?
Mm-hmm.
Well, good.
Yeah.
What's gotten into you?
I'm just happy.
All right. Well, good.
It's Tuesday.
It is. Welcome back, everybody. This is a true crime podcast. So viewer or listener, all of it, discretion is advised. But there again, if you are here, I would assume that you know why you're here. Welcome to everybody. I'm going to get over to the chats real quick. If you are listening just from an audio streaming service, this is a live YouTube show every week. So we engage with the folks in the chats. That's free. All you have to do is get a YouTube account, sign in, and you can just go to the chats and talk to us, talk to other friends in the chats, ask questions about the case, ask us our favorite color, whatever it is that you feel like you need to do. So tonight, the case we are talking about comes from 1988. So if you have listened to this show at all, you know that we often like to talk about a little pop culture in the year in which the case took place. And we have a pop culture guru here by my side in the studio. And I couldn't be more thankful. Would you like to tell us what was going on in 1988?
Well, right off the bat, let's get the serious thing. Well, it's actually not the most serious of 88, but Supreme Court rules that your trash can, sitting by the curb or by the road for pickup is now unprotected. Therefore, law enforcement detectives and officers can ride by and grab that trash.
Ooh.
It's no longer considered property.
So for those of you who may be new to Night Shift, Brian Sanders is a retired homicide lieutenant. So obviously he lends a lot of expertise to these oftentimes unresolved or unsolved cases that we cover. And we talk about investigations and the process of all of that, et cetera. So what was the most surprising thing you ever procured out of a trash can?
Oh.
Yeah. I don't even know the answer to this, so I'm sorry I'll get you on the fly.
About a foot long, I don't know, what we call it, a pin? No. About a foot long appendage thing?
A toy.
A toy. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that's probably...
Was that what y'all were looking for?
No.
Oh.
No, you come across those all the time in searches, and that was. I mean, other than straight up trash and garbage, but the technique of taking someone's trash is oftentimes used by drug units. But really good homicide detectives and violent crime detectives will do that to get evidence, as well as just to kind of get an idea of what's going on in somebody. So anyway, that happened. Geraldo Rivera gets his nose broken on live TV during a taping of a show with civil rights activist Roy Ennis. And then
I kind of wish that I might add that. I might add that to the intro.
Okay.
When it's showing. It shows. So if you watch this show on YouTube, the first 30 seconds is just kind of a compilation I put together. I've covered all of the cases of the people that we've shown, but it's a compilation of victims and the bad guys. And so if I put Geraldo somewhere in the middle, you can decide if you think he's a victim or a bad guy.
Yeah. Well, he was bringing civil rights activist Roy Ennis and then John Metzger on the neo-Nazi side.
I remember.
The fight broke out. And I think that was a huge deal at that time for public TV. In the music realm of 88,
hit me.
4 albums are released. This is kind of like when hip hop hits the mainstream.
Okay.
Right? So Public Enemy's It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back is released.
Nice.
Boogie Down Productions, By Any Means Necessary. Eric B. and Rakim, Follow the Leader. And then NWA, Straight Outta Compton.
Yeah.
So
it's a good year.
It's kind of, some people would say, sort of the birth of gangster rap. And then you see where record labels start pushing their their product, and it's not in the conscious and the
Sure.
socially aware. Anyway, so that was a big year for that music. You get into movies.
Okay.
Beetlejuice was released that year. Bull Durham. Baseball
that's a good
movie
one, yeah.
Set in North Carolina. The movie Colors.
Oh, yeah.
About Bloods and Crips and other gangs out in L.A. The Decline of Western Civilization Part 2, The Metal Years. And that's kind of a documentary on a bunch of heavy metal bands that some would call or say they were Satan worshipers. And this was kind of in that realm.
We will be talking about some of that.
Yes.
Tonight.
So then in television, you get into a show called Freddy's Nightmares.
Ooh.
Based on Freddy Krueger from Nightmare on Elm Street.
Like, I didn't realize, I've realized now that we do this pop culture segment, that happened so much more in the 80s than I ever knew. And even into the early 90s, where we often talk about, or he'll find that there was, and some of them I've heard of, some of them I've not, but like a mini series or a small TV segment or production coming off of like the big blockbuster hits at the time. It's always so weird. Yeah,
and that show was not only ran for 2 years. It was basically, for those listening and watching, there were short stories. It was not like an ongoing story of Freddy Krueger. He was just the host.
I forgot. Oh gosh, it's coming back to me now.
Yeah, he would like come on there.
And not Tales from the Crypt, but he would be like the Crypt Keeper, right? Like
as a matter of fact, I'm glad you said that. My notes are that Freddy's Nightmare show in '88 came out 1 year after, or 1 year before Tales from the Crypt.
Oh.
But I bet they were filming it, and I bet the ideas were going around Hollywood because it's almost the exact same thing.
Oh, I remember that now. Oh, okay.
Now, Freddy's Nightmares had Brad Pitt on one episode.
Oh, really?
Kyle Chandler. Name pops up again.
Yes, it does.
And the worst class president of Calumet High School in 1984.
Go for it.
Darren Dalton. The guy who was the traitor in Red Dawn. He acted on one of the episodes. Speaking of movies made in the TV shows, RoboCop, the animated series for kids.
Well, at least it was, yeah. That I can get behind some of the cartoony stuff, I guess.
Yeah, that was one season as well. It was rated for 7-year-olds and up. Could watch RoboCop shoot up people. And then the third.
Wait, did it really have that rating?
Yeah. And it may not have been at the time, but now it's considered Y7 or something. I don't think they had the rating.
There's no way it was at the time.
Yeah, now that I think about it, no.
Things were, I think things were still, I think like boobs were flying and stuff was PG still most of the time back then. So like, I can't imagine that an animated RoboCop had an age restriction.
Yeah. I know like G.I. Joe, they were shooting a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Quite a bit.
That's fine.
Then there was a show called Super Carrier. Just let that one sink
Pandemic?
in.
Is that what? Well,
no, not like a super carrier.
Oh, like
or a super courier.
Like a
super carrier.
Of what?
Like a ship in the Navy.
Oh.
A ship in the Navy.
I got you.
Like an aircraft carrier.
Yeah.
But I guess this one was big. But it was basically, if I remember right, kind of based on Top Gun.
Okay.
There were 8 episodes, in case you were wondering.
Nope.
And then we'll get into in 1988, the height of BADD. It's an organization called Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons.
Okay, for real?
No, it's for real. Yeah. It's kind of sad.
Was that before Mad?
Probably. It was actually found in like 83 or 84. But by 88, it's kind of made its rounds. And there was almost like this push against Dungeons and Dragons, which had been around since like 1974, I think, or 76.
Oh, I've got some stats on that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself.
Don't you be.
But BADD, BADD, was formed by a lady who sadly her son had committed suicide and he played Dungeons and Dragons. So she kind of went on the offense. And then in 88 was the same year a man passed away who had actually sued Judas Priest over his suicide attempt. And he basically said it was based on the subliminal messages. Yeah. 88 was legit for Satanic Panic. And also in 88, this will tie in maybe a little bit later, a tornado destroys a large part of Raleigh, North Carolina.
Okay.
$77 million worth of damage. And it's a series of tornadoes that has stretched across the state, but killed 2 people in Raleigh. Does Raleigh tie into our story?
Absolutely.
All right. I think that's a good transition right there.
Sorry about that. Was I not picking up what you were putting down?
yeah. That was the wishbone option I pitched.
That's all right. It's all right. I don't need softballs. We got this. Yeah, so our case does actually take place in and around the Raleigh area in 1988. We are going to touch on Satanic Panic and Dungeons and Dragons and quite a few things. So we might as well get to it. I'm trying to think if there's any updates on any of the cases that are kind of swirling right now. If you haven't, I would go back and listen to a row house murder, and then there were 3. It's part 2. That's what we did last week. Part 1 is great, but it was just kind of the bare bones facts. And then part 2, we kind of quickly covered the facts and got into the wild part of it all. And it's still, I'm still reeling from that one. That's such a strange case, but you ought to go check that out if you have not already. So I'm going to go on and take you guys back. We're going to go back to an area in the southeast, but we're going to actually go back a little farther from that, because I'm going to tell you a little bit about a couple named Bonnie and Leith von Stein. Okay. So on July 25th of 1988, there was a call into the Beaufort County Law Enforcement Center. So I've heard it said, people call it all kinds of things. I did hear on another podcast, she's from the area and she knew to say it that way. But in North Carolina, it's Beau, Fort, right? And it's pronounced Beaufort here. In South Carolina, it's pronounced Beaufort. So just know that when I say it, that is how it's said here, because we are here in North Carolina. So they get a phone call from a woman, and I'm going to try to play it for you. Here's the deal, though. It's very short. It's not a long 911 call, but it's also very, very low. Let's see if I have it here. Well, I may not have actually. Let's see. Bear with me, folks. Bear with me. Okay.
Most people to imagine.
Can I help you? Well, what do you need, ma'am? Police. Ambulance. Why do you need an ambulance?
So basically, it's just a lady that says, I need police and an ambulance. But she's almost whispering, and the dispatcher is asking her to speak up. She's concerned that someone may still be in the home, and she's saying, I think my husband's dead and I may be dying too. And that's about it. So the lady, the dispatcher she talked to, actually tells her that her own husband, the dispatcher's husband, is a police officer, and she's sending out, multiple units, everyone that she can, out to the home where Bonnie was calling from. So they get there to this scene, okay? And so, again, this was 44-year-old Bonnie von Stein that made that 911 call. So they get there. The first 3 on scene were Danny Edwards, Ed Cherry, and Brad Tedderton. So they get there. It's a 2-story house. As you can imagine, weapons drawn. They don't know what they're going to see. This is a very small town in North Carolina, kind of coastal North Carolina, called Little Washington. Some accounts will just call it Washington, North Carolina. It's known as Little Washington. So when you hear me say that, we are talking about a coastal town in North Carolina. Okay. So they get there to this home in Little Washington. The house is dark. They start sweeping their flashlights. They don't know what they're getting into. They notice that there's a broken window beside the back porch. There's a porch door that is open, but the window beside it is broken. Okay. Keep these things in mind. So they get to the home, they get through the kitchen. When they get to the kitchen, they see the very typical setup of like the stove with the microwave over it. And like the, you know how you can get like the stove light or like the under the hood or microwave light on. So that's on, glaring down onto the stovetop. And there is going to be a woman's handbag. So a white purse, contents kind of array on top of the stove. And then they say that they immediately smelled blood. If you've smelled blood, you know that copper scent is what am I trying to say? It's, you know exactly what it is. And he said that he actually, one of the detectives looked at the other one and just said, somebody's dead. They knew that that smell was overwhelming. It was, you know, too much blood to smell when you're in a room that has no blood, right? So they know that they're about to stumble upon something very bad. So they kind of sweep downstairs. They don't really find anything down there abnormally. And they go on upstairs. So upstairs, the hallway has, I believe, 5 doors. So they go to the first one on their right. And when they do, that's actually the master. That's where they have intended to go. So they can't see Bonnie or Leith at first. And I think she starts to kind of whisper out as they sweep their flashlights around. So when they finally land on here, they say Tedderton actually said that it was the most horrible sight he'd ever encountered. And he had been in law enforcement for 26 years at that time. So the blood they talk about was everywhere. It was on 3 walls of the room, all over the floor. We'll talk about it a little bit more. But that's the first thing they get. So they have now a visual of that aroma that they had earlier on downstairs in the kitchen. So they see that lying across the bed, kind of diagonally, was a bigger guy, a larger man who had on his just like white briefs that were no longer white. Everything was matted in blood. Everything was covered in blood on the bed. And so they could see that he was lying face down, and there were wounds visible on his back. There were stab wounds on his upper back and his left shoulder. And they say that there was a crater to the back of his head so bad that Detective Tedderton said that he thought he could probably look inside the man's skull by way of the depression that he saw there. They knew pretty quickly that there was nothing that they were going to be able to do to save the man on the bed. So Bonnie, who had called 911, is lying on the floor next to the bed, and she tells the detective that her husband was trying to help her, and this intruder had attacked both of them with, quote, a big club or a baseball bat. She wasn't quite sure at this time, as you can imagine, and a knife. Okay, so the other cop at this time, because you got to think they still don't know what's going on in this home and if anybody bad is still in there. So Danny, this guy Danny, has gone to the next bedroom. He had learned that they actually have a 17-year-old daughter named Angela who was in the home. Bonnie made sure to tell them to go check on Angela. Just on a side note, Bonnie was known around town to be like a rescuer of cats in the town. So they actually had like 13 cats in the home. This was a really nice home, but they had like 13 cats in this home. And which always, I don't know, kind of cracks me up, and a rooster. So at some point a rooster had made its way into their home, and she continued to like raise it. But when she called 911, it just kind of gives you a little bit of an idea into like Bonnie's character. But when she called 911, she was within her wits enough to say, please tell the cops that I have, you know, like all these cats, like to try not to hurt the cats or whatever. So Danny Edwards has gone to the next bedroom over. Again, he had been told that their 17-year-old daughter, Angela, was sleeping in the home. So they get there. It's the room directly next to Bonnie and Leith's bedroom in the master, okay? She's asleep. So when they find Angela, she is asleep in her room. She's got on a T-shirt, and she has a big, like one of the big square, like box fans, which may or may not play a part in this. I'll let you decide. The big box fan is going in the corner of her room. Okay. This was July in North Carolina. It's hot. There's no getting around that. But beside Angela on the nightstand is actually a glass of water that had ice cubes that had not yet melted. Put that in the box. Let me say, put that in the box of things that maybe, we could make them make sense maybe later on as we talk some more, or maybe they don't. But just the kind of the question mark items we'll throw in that box. And her being asleep and her glass of water with ice cubes unmelted, I will consider to put those in the box. So evidently the cop wakes her up. So she has slept through not only the attack, she sleeps through the vehicles, the emergency vehicles, sirens, and getting there and getting in the home and getting up the stairs and going in the room where her mom and you'll learn later her stepdad Leith were. And to the point that he walks into her room to wake her up. Okay. So she said that she has been asleep the whole time. He tells her that there's been a situation in the house. Of course, he's trying to not overwhelm her with information in this moment, but he tells her to quickly get dressed. She needs to get dressed and meet him outside the room. So she does with no hesitation. So he goes on to continue to kind of sweep the rest of the upstairs. He finds no one else. At this point, they can kind of at least take a breath and realize that we don't have any intruders currently in the home. It's a safe scene in that respect. So the dispatcher that when Bonnie called 911 that she spoke to, I told you that her husband was actually one of the police officers that would be arriving to the scene. And his name, that was David. That was the one who just went in to wake up Angela. Okay. So he had actually been an EMT before he became a police officer. And when he got there, he says he got there with shotgun and medical equipment. And he said that he had never seen anything like it in all of his years as an EMT or as a cop. He said that he did kind of check on Leith, the gentleman lying on the bed, and immediately realized also that it was too late to render any aid. And then he said when he looked at Bonnie, he realized she had been stabbed in the chest. She was having some difficulty breathing, which will make sense when we go over her injuries a little bit later. He put some oxygen on her, and she was kind of in and out of consciousness at this point. She was, though, begging. I think parents do this. Our kids are always on our mind. And so she's begging the officers to not let Angela in the room. She couldn't see much of anything, but she knew it was not a scene that her daughter needed to be privy to. And that was that. They start to try to kind of bring the stretcher in and get her out. So the two EMTs that come by ambulance just moments later go on to recount later that they had expected blood based on the call that they received, what they had understood the information to be, but that the room was, quote, literally awash in it. They say that blood had been sprayed and spattered on the ceiling, on 3 walls of the room. The carpet was bloodied on both sides of the bed for more than 3 feet out on each side. They go to Leith and they turn him over. They had already seen, obviously, the stab wounds on his back and the depression to the back of his skull, like where his skull was caved in the back. They also saw a large stab wound to the center of his chest. We will later determine upon autopsy that stab wound actually went straight through the heart. His eyes were swollen and closed. Remember, he had been lying face down. He had a beard. I can show you a picture of Leith now so you can have an idea. He had a beard, but they say that, his beard was, as you can imagine, completely matted and covered in blood. Here's a picture of Leith. Excuse me. They say that his left hand was clenched. He had 5 gaping wounds on his head. 3 were across his forehead. 1 was above his left eyebrow. And then he had a terrible one to the back of his left ear. And 6 stab wounds from a large bladed knife in his upper back, left shoulder, the one to his chest. And he was what they said looked like bathed in blood. There was no pulse. And in fact, the blood that was on his chest was already beginning to kind of get gelatinous. It was kind of starting to get sticky and dry up and get jelly-like. So they immediately go to Bonnie. She did have cuts on her head, a stab wound to her chest, that wasn't bleeding any longer, but she had lost a lot of blood and her blood pressure was dropping pretty rapidly. So she gets to the hospital. They're starting to treat her and get her to the hospital. And during all of this time, we have the officer Tedderton, who was speaking with Angela, the daughter, downstairs. So she doesn't really have anything to say other than she's been sleeping. She did not hear Leith's screams. Later, Bonnie will say that what woke her up were the screams of her husband. So she didn't wake up to being battered with a bat or being stabbed. She was waking up to his screams. But Angela is telling the detective downstairs that she slept through it all. No, she did not hear her stepfather's screams. The police officer noted that she seemed to him to be detached to the news that this had all just taken place. Now, we talk every week about this, though, and shock and trauma, people can look very detached, and that can be a normal response to trauma. That does not implicate her in any way. It's just something to take note of as we go on to continue her behaviors moving forward with this. She did say that she has a brother named Chris, and Chris was away at NC State. So NC State University, obviously North Carolina State University, that's in Raleigh. So that's about 2 hours away from Little Washington, where they are in this home at this moment. So he goes on and tells her to go on and call your brother. Like, right now, let's give him a call. So she does. So Detective John Taylor was one of the officers that arrived on scene that night, and he was actually the youngest detective in the Little Washington Police Department. He was 27 years old. So he had gotten there after Bonnie had been taken out on the stretcher. So as he starts to kind of look at the scene, look at what they've got, kind of work this house, he said that it looked pretty apparent that the intruder had entered and left the home by the back porch. But the broken window by the door didn't really make a lot of sense because the door itself had like 9 individual panes of glass. And it would be impossible to be able to reach in through the broken window that was up top and get to the door that way or unlock the door. And in fact, they say it was kind of like, kind of silly because with the door having all these individual panes of glass, there was one right there literally beside the lock and the doorknob. Mm-hmm. So that's already just kind of something a little askew that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. He said that there was like cuts in the window screen, but they don't match the breaks in the glass. Also, they found like a faded green backpack out there by the back door that he was just looking at. And it didn't seem obviously to belong there. It's sitting outside on the ground beside like a plastic garbage can. All right. So this case doesn't have we don't have a whole big timeline. We have more of a backstory on this case. So, often we talk and we get into details of an autopsy. We get into witness statements. We get into very specific timelines. And this one doesn't really have any of that. It's very straightforward in terms of the actual murder and attempted murder. But once we go over this, then we're going to go back in time and kind of potentially what led up to what happened this night. And while we often cover unresolved or unsolved, this one is not. There have been convictions in this murder, okay? But there are still some questions. So I always like to have something that seems like that have a few questions left over, and this one kind of certainly does. So they kind of go on to look. Remember, I told you that there was a woman's purse lying on the stove with contents were out, like under the microwave light. And so they see that it's kind of been rifled through, but it didn't really look like a typical robbery in the sense that like TVs, VCRs, there was like a $20 bill on the nightstand. There were a couple of watches, a wallet, things that would be very easy to grab in the event that this was a robbery. Bonnie's wedding rings evidently were in a small bowl, other jewelry. So they're starting to kind of quickly piece together the fact that they find it very unlikely that a robbery was to have taken place here. And it really is starting to look like the entire intent was to kill Leith and Bonnie. So the doctor at the Beaufort County Hospital's emergency room assesses Bonnie, finds that she has 3 lacerations on her head. He described them as ragged. She has 2 near the headline and 1 at the center of her forehead. Another one was over her right eyebrow. Her left thumb was broken. She'll later say that when she was moving in the bed and trying to avoid the attacker, he had come to her side of the bed, and she did get her thumb did get smashed against the table with the baseball bat. So that's how her thumb got broken. Her above her right breast was they say about a grapefruit sized bruise, and to the right of her sternum was the stab wound that actually the blade bounced off the sternum and kind of nicked her a little bit internally there and partially collapsed that lung. So that would explain her shortness of breath when they had gotten to the scene. She was still alive. So we're going to talk later about whether or not it can be argued that her stab wounds were or were not life-threatening and what that could potentially mean moving forward in the case. So Chris is Angela's brother, okay? So Chris and Angela were Bonnie's children from a previous marriage. So she'd gotten married very young in the sense that I think she was 19 or 20 and the guy was 18. And this was when she had obviously soon after she graduated high school. I believe if I remember correctly, the story goes that they had gotten married, go on a honeymoon, and he has to come back to school after the honeymoon. It's one of those. He was still in high school. He's with them for a little while. They have the two kids. And then I think the kids were like 2 and 4, Chris being the senior of the two, when he kind of was out of the picture. So he just really wasn't a presence in the children's lives. So definitely by this point, when they are now 17, 18, and 19 or 20, their biological father had not been in the picture for a very long time. Okay, so excuse me. So Chris, remember, was in NC State when this all happened. So he has to travel the 2 hours back to Little Washington. So he gets there around 8:30 in the morning that Monday morning. This all took place overnight on a Sunday night into Monday. So he actually had been driven down by the safety patrol, the parking lot safety patrol officers for NC State, for the college, because he couldn't in a rush find his car keys to get himself down there. And so we're going to talk about what he had been doing that evening around the same time all of this was taking place. But so those officers from the school campus escorted him down. They drove him down to the hospital in Little Washington. So they say that during his 2-hour drive back to Little Washington, he'd curled up in the back seat of the patrol car and gone to sleep. He didn't wake until they got to the Little Washington Police Department. And when he was there, they told him that, his mom was in the hospital. She was expected to survive. And they do tell him at this point that his stepfather is dead. And they say that, to contrast Angela seeming detached and unemotional when she got the news while she was in the home that it happened. Chris, they say, he, quote, attempted to be grief-stricken, but he wasn't quite making it. So this was kind of their initial idea of Chris's reaction. Okay. So he did ask to go to the hospital to see his mom before he spoke with authorities. And they did grant that. So they let him sit and hold her hand in the ICU. And she proceeds to tell him what she remembers had happened. And Chris cried. Okay. So that gets Chris back home. Now we have mom in the hospital, Chris at her bedside, and Angela's kind of in and around the area at this time. So the detectives start to look at the family and at the dynamics and at the friends and kind of start to try to make a case here and figure something out. So we'll take you back. So Leith, the victim in this murder and attempted murder, Leith von Stein was born actually in New York. He was born in Queens. He was an only child. His parents were of German descent. I think that's pretty obvious with the last name of von Stein. And these were pretty wealthy families and really kind of entrepreneurial type business owners. So they moved to Winston-Salem, North Carolina when he was just a little baby. Okay. And they actually began to run a dry cleaning business that expanded to become one of the most successful in the actual country. So it becomes this really big dry cleaning business. They have over 130 employees, many, many branches. So Leith starts to grow up. He graduates. He actually went to the School of Engineering at North Carolina State, so at NC State, where, furthermore, his stepson's going to be at. But he flunked out the end of his junior year, and the Vietnam War was going on at this point. He was finally drafted. He was sent to Germany, oddly enough, for clerical work. He was discharged honorably in 1970 and returned back to North Carolina, re-enrolled in college in Greensboro this time. They say that he was outspoken. He was very intellectual. He had a dry sense of humor, and he was very close with his parents. So he gets this job at a place called Intigon. And so this was an insurance company in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. So when he's working there, he meets a woman who also had an interest in computers, and this is Bonnie. So he meets what's going to become his future wife there at that job, and she was 2 years older than Leith. Seems to be a commonplace theme with her. But so she's 2 years older than Leith. She already had, like I said, these two children. She had been at this point separated from her husband, and she was native to North Carolina herself. So they kind of start to spend time together. Again, her ex-husband or the kid's father was not in the picture. And so as time goes on and they're working together, Bonnie and Leith are spending a little bit more time together. And they have a dinner date at her house. That's their first date. They start spending time together. And when the kids would go to bed, they'd watch TV, this kind of thing. They eventually introduce each other to their parents, so on and so forth. And in August of 79, Leith gets a new job at a finance company in Indiana and asked Bonnie to go with him as his wife. So she did, and they got married in August of 79. So she had this job for a long time, the one in Winston-Salem, for I think about 15 years. So she and the kids pack up and move with him to this place in Indiana for this new job. But he's not really wishy-washy, but just kind of a lot of parts are moving at this point. His parents were aging, and in 1981, he wound up taking a different position back in North Carolina. Okay, so he's back in Little Washington, North Carolina, and that's where they moved. That's where all of this eventually kind of takes place. So when they get back to Little Washington, they're both very happy with this move. And this is when they move to the house at 110 on Lawson Road. That's going to be important here in a moment. So Bonnie began teaching at a local community college in 1983. And they're just kind of back and forth advancing in career moves, both of them. So in 1987, Leith's dad died suddenly. His mom was incredibly grief-stricken, did not take this well. She actually only died 4 months later. Okay, so when his parents both died, they left an estate that was valued at more than $1.2 million. This was $1.2 million in 1988. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that would be closer to $4 million now. So they already had their own wealth. They also had, dad had life insurance that mom gets, right? Then they have their estate. So he gets really depressed, as you can imagine, but he's depressed over the sudden death of both of his parents. He doesn't really know what to do. But then you find out that in addition to that $1.2 million inheritance from the estate, there was also $1 million of life insurance that Leith had for himself. So when Leith, fast forward, gets murdered, Bonnie is set to inherit now over $2 million. Okay? Mm-hmm. Leith never had children of his own. So Bonnie was set to take this money, but she was ruled out pretty quickly as a viable suspect. Of course, they're going to look at her first. I know she was wounded in this, but they do go on and rule her out as a suspect. But if she dies, she was attacked, right? So if she dies, who gets the money? Chris and Angela. Her children would then get the money. Mm-hmm. Okay? So detectives start talking to Chris, her son. Again, remember, he was in North Carolina. He was in NC State. He was in Raleigh, 2 hours away when his stepdad was murdered, when this attack took place. So they talked to him that Monday night around 10:30 at night, and they were at a friend's house. He and Angela were staying at a friend's house during this time. So they say that at this time he was 19, but detectives go on to say that he looked about 16. He was kind of slight in frame, chain smoking, tank top, baseball cap. Here's a picture of Chris at the time. Gotta love that hair. He looks like a little rooster. Speaking of the rooster in the house.
Kind of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kind of all spiky on top.
Yeah.
So that's Chris. So he tells detectives that he'd come home to visit that weekend. Remember, the attack happened overnight on a Sunday night, and he said he had come home on a Friday night to the home on Lawson Road. He said that he had a term paper due that Monday, so that's why he went on back to school on Saturday evening after they ate dinner. We're going to discuss that. But on Sunday night, he'd gone out with friends, went back to the dorms, and he says that he was up until about 3 or 3:30 drinking beer and playing cards. He said he'd only been in his dorm room and he'd only been in bed for a short time when he got the call from his sister about the attack. Okay, so he tells them exactly what had happened, that the public safety officers from NC State drove him back to Little Washington. He'd been distraught. He couldn't find his car keys, so he needed their assistance. He said that as far as he knew, there weren't any, trouble. There was no trouble in paradise. His mom and by really all accounts, his dad, because that's who's really raised him. I think that gets a little skewed here in the sense that a lot of the sources will say, he and his stepdad butt heads and he and his stepdad, but like, he wasn't like a new stepdad to Chris. He'd been in his life for a very long time, since he was a little bitty kid. So he says that, again, there had been no problems there. He said that he and Leith, stepdad, got along, and he said that they got along really well and they had a good relationship. This starts to be a bit contradicted when they start interviewing other friends and family, okay, about Chris's relationship with his stepdad and how it had been, at least we should say, lately. Okay, so Chris says that he knew that Leith, he'd come into maybe some stock money or something like that, but he didn't really know details. Oh, that's not exactly true, because Bonnie herself will say that she told Chris by her own mouth exactly how much Leith inherited and how much he was insured for. So she's given this information to Chris, but he says, "Oh, I don't know. He had some money." So we're gonna put that in the box. So going just kind of, checking their gut. Cops are not feeling so great about this. They're not a big fan of Chris at this time. Okay. So next thing you know, an unexpected break comes in this case. So there was a farmer, a guy named Noel Lee. Okay. He's I think a hog farmer. Around 4:30 in the morning, on that Monday morning, right, from that Sunday leading into Monday, he had just finished this long process where he'd like kind of loaded up these hogs and done stuff at his farm. Okay. So this is about 7 miles from Little Washington, and he was heading back home and he noticed a fire. Well, this is an outdoorsman. This is a farmer, a pig farmer. So things that are not of the norm, right? He's going to pay attention to things maybe that someone else may drive by and not know too much about, right? So he was curious enough that he drove his truck over to the fire. And he said that it was about 3 or 4 feet in height and maybe just like a foot or 2 in diameter. So it wasn't huge, but it was kind of had burned high, right? It's kind of like tall to be that narrow. And he said that it burned so brightly, he knew that it had to have been fueled by something. So an accelerant had been used. This was not like a normal campfire or brush fire, in that sense. But he didn't get out of his truck. He said that he was just exhausted. He couldn't imagine anything bad about this, or it just struck him as odd, but that was kind of it. He drives home, didn't think much about it until he hears about the murder of Leith von Stein, and then he thinks, oh, that felt like a weird time to see a fire. That did feel weird. So he lets the authorities know. So old Noel winds up being an invaluable asset at this point, more so than he could have ever known to be. So he remembered the exact time that he noted the fire, and I bet he could, right? He could probably tell you where the moon was in the sky at this point if he's used to being out there at nighttime like this. He recalled exactly where it had been burning, and so on that Tuesday evening, so this is only 24 hours after they had interviewed Chris, so that Tuesday night, he takes the detectives exactly where he had seen the fire. And he said, obviously the fire has burned out at this point, right? But there's a blackened circle there, and there's some debris there that has been charred and kind of partially burned. So they find a socket for an extension wrench. They find burned remnants of blue jeans, the remains of a sweater that had kind of melted and burned, the bottom of a Reebok sneaker, and a large hunting knife. Its handle was melted and its blade was approximately 6 inches long and blackened. They said that they found some wadded up sheets of paper. One of them was partially burned and they'd kind of, blown up and out. You know how a fire produces a bit of a draft or wind. And so they had burned kind of blown out and about away from the fire. So they come back the next day, photograph the area a little bit more, investigate a little bit more, don't really find anything else more than they initially found when they saw this area. So they start to examine what they found that had been burned, right? So the knife that they found would be consistent with the wounds that Leith von Stein had to his body. So get this, guys. I love stuff like this because who would have thought, right? So one of the singed pieces of paper that they found was actually a map, like a hand-drawn map, like on notebook paper. It was just drawn with like a ballpoint pen. It wasn't a very detailed anything, right? So there was only one word kind of that was super legible on the map, and that was the word Lawson. There were like blocks, squares that were drawn in that looked to be like homes, almost like Monopoly homes, if you're just drawing a crude map, right? And there was one that had an X on it, and it had 110 written on it. That would be 110 Lawson Road. That was the Von Stein address.
That's how we used to have to draw maps. That's how you draw directions. You would put that, yeah.
Well, and that's what he did. I mean, the fact that, the paper didn't get burned up completely, the fact that you could see that it had an X on 110 Lawson. I don't know. I thought that was crazy. Yeah. So they're going to go on and have a funeral service for Leith, and this was going to be on July 28th. Okay, so let's see here. I want to make sure I don't want to tell you any dates wrong. So the murder took place on, we'll call it Monday. This would have been like an overnight Sunday into Monday attack. So Monday's date was the 25th. So this is the 28th. So 3 days later, we're having Leith's funeral. So the funeral home actually sent a car to Bonnie, who was in the hospital still recovering, and she just had on kind of a black nightgown basically, and she wore that, rode in the funeral home's car to the site, was present at the funeral, and then went back to recover at the hospital for like 3 or 4 more days. Okay, so they hold the service. And then on Friday, July 29th, so this would have been 4 days after this man is brutally attacked. And let's say that he wasn't even murdered. Let's say she was just attacked in her home and survived. Just the trauma of, the fear that happened, that your home was broken into, you were violently attacked. Well, on Friday, July 29th, the end of that same week, Little Washington was holding their annual summer festival. And so they would have like live music, you can imagine, right? Food, vendors, all these kinds of things. And Angela and Chris, the son and daughter of Bonnie, went to the summer festival. I mean,
I get maybe some people would do that.
Let's get out of the house for a minute and try to.
That's tough though. That's like within 4 days. Yeah.
And their mom's in the hospital. I mean, you could maybe that solely, it is what it is. Maybe mom can say like, you guys don't worry about me. Just go, here's some money, go enjoy some time, maybe get something, I don't know. It's just something to note. So detectives are starting to now we've got some puzzle pieces, right? So they're starting to put some things together, and they're putting together the time and location of where the fire took place, because we have such a great witness account from that farmer, Noel. And they believe that after killing Leith and trying to kill Bonnie, whoever did this had driven west on this certain highway and obviously searched for a good area to ditch all of their stuff. So they kind of start to realize where they need to be quiet, right? Who they need to talk to and what information they need to start letting out or not, because now we're starting to enlarge the investigation to include Raleigh, because now we know that if you go west on that same highway 264, you're going to end up in Raleigh, and that's where NC State is located, where Chris was a student. Okay, so they go on and ask Chris to draw a map of the Von Stein neighborhood. Okay, so they give him a ballpoint pen similar to the one used that they found at the fire. And as you can imagine, I'm sure you know exactly where this is going. They have him label the streets. So they compare that second map with the first, with the professional opinion, experts, all this kind of thing. And obviously, you know what I'm going to say. They say that the Lawson that Chris had printed on the second map, they had him print it twice, and it was identical to that on the first map. Again, you know, it's one of those things we talk often about tools that are used. You're not going to use that handwriting evidence alone, or, you know, the testimony of a hand writing expert alone, but we're just going to put it in with the puzzle pieces. So they start to talk to different coworkers of Chris's, former girlfriends, other school friends, and they all start to talk about how after graduation, Chris had really been like getting really big into alcohol and drugs. Okay. So it started with him smoking some pot. He started getting into cocaine. And it started getting more and more and more and more. Okay. So she says, one of his ex-girlfriends says that he even was a little bit extra handsy with her, even when like kind of rebuking his efforts. He didn't like that and would get a little pushy and would continue to try. And so that girl said that she's has no contact with him since that time, but she said he could not stop talking about his new fascination, which was a game called Dungeons and Dragons. So if you were here for the first part of the show, we discussed Dungeons and Dragons, and we are going to get into it now here in a moment. And I want to let you guys decide what you think about this, okay? Because I had a thought, which let me write it down now because I will forget completely. Didn't. Okay. Alrighty. So Chris had a roommate during his freshman year, and this person told detectives that he and Chris didn't really ever hang out together. Like they had different habits, that Chris didn't ever study. All he wanted to do was party. And the roommate said that Chris would read books about Dungeons and Dragons in his room, but he never played that game there. And we're going to tell you where he did, in fact, play the game, however. So they spoke to another teenager who I guess was someone who often supplied Chris with his pot. And then you find out that actually he's been using a lot of LSD. So Chris has been using a lot of acid. And we know we're not going to get into this too much and kind of nerd out on it, but the idea of a psychedelic, and specifically like a synthetic psychedelic, like an LSD and acid, to any brain, but predominantly to like a teenage brain, is not great, right? We're talking about rewiring, reworking. That I don't think that you can kind of downplay those implications, because it can be very severe. So evidently Chris was kind of a braggy kind of guy. Okay. So they say that he kind of like threw his money around. I think that Bonnie and Leith had been giving him quite an excessive allowance up until the point that he even left high school and went into college, supplying him with a decent amount of money. And so he would tell his friends that his parents were wealthy. In fact, his very first car was like a classic Mustang, nice computers, the weekly allowance, all of this stuff. So they say that he was pretty easily influenced by others. He was a follower, and that he was doing very poorly at school because of the drinking and the drugs. And he really just spent all of his time playing Dungeons and Dragons. Okay. So again, if you are just coming in, this is the year 1988. So think it's almost as though if you put Stranger Things back, if that was real life, right? So the cops start to talk, and they find a couple of female students who had hung out with Chris and another friend on that night, the night of the actual murder. Okay. So they say that he had gotten there, but he actually parked in a weird spot he doesn't usually park at. And that was like out in the outer fringe parking lot of the school, like not near the dorms. And they say that they can remember that evening really well because he was incessant about wanting to play cards with them. And he continued to open more beer, and play cards. And they wanted him to go home. So they say that they didn't even start playing cards until around 10 o'clock or so. And then at about like 1:30 in the morning, one of the girls actually asked Chris to please leave. Like they were just getting tired. And he continues to ignore them. And at finally like 3:30, he left. But it wasn't until he had asked them multiple times throughout that evening, what time is it? What time is it? What time is it? And they're asking him to leave, and he continues to check the time. You know, we're going with that.
Mm-hmm.
So around 3:30 or more, he's like, fine, I'll leave. I think he's like, my alibi has been completed.
Yeah.
I shall go home now. So she said that that Chris actually had been resentful of his stepfather, and he seemed jealous that his stepfather spent money on his mother, on Bonnie, and didn't spend his money on Chris and his sister as much as he thought that he should have. But like I said, do you remember he had bought him this classic Mustang for his birthday and the computers and the weekly allowance? So it sounds like he got plenty from him. But again, Chris was not a good student. And so while they're providing him with all of this stuff, he's just kind of throwing it all to the wind. So he's kind of wilding out on coke and acid and Dungeons and Dragons. Coke and acid and Dungeons and Dragons. No.
What's that?
I was thinking about like a band name, but it's just too long.
Yeah, that's too long.
Coke and acid and Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, that could be a name of an
album. What does it sound like? Maybe maybe an album. Yeah. That would be good.
Yeah.
Okay, somebody make that. But he had been a good student in school until his senior year. Okay, so that's whatever. That's enough about that part of Chris's life. But evidently, we learned that just like the week prior to Leith's murder, Leith and Chris had a fallen out, and it was about his grades. And so basically they were having a come to Jesus in the sense of like, get your grades up or we're no longer paying for you to go to school. Like, we're done with this. And so they had kind of come to a head. So that's where I think it gets misconstrued when people are like, oh, he and his stepdad butted heads. It wasn't that they had consistently butted heads throughout Chris's life. It's just that as he got older and was acting a fool and wasting money and resources and doing drugs and not, going to the school they're providing him, then they started butting heads. I think, unfortunately, that can be a common theme with parents and children. And so the detectives are starting to formulate what they believe could be a pretty solid motive for Leith's murder and the murder of Bonnie, or the attempted murder of Bonnie. And we know that we had that over $2 million inheritance from Leith at this point. What Chris didn't know, however, had this been his way of thinking or his mastermind plot, that neither Chris nor Angela could have received their share until they reached 35 years old anyway. So even had his mother died as well and he and Angela get this inheritance, his 19-year-old self was not going to get it until he was 35. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about Dungeons and Dragons. I did not play it, so I personally didn't.
Yes, you did.
No, I did not. And it's fine if you did.
I didn't, but I know people who did.
I'm sorry. I don't often engage in the chats during the case, but since we have a break, we have when the coke bites. When the weed stings. It's a whole thing. I'm not reading all of it, but
I got you.
It was witty. I'll give you that. All right. The chats go away eventually. So, all right. So Dungeons and Dragons, again, Brian Sanders was like a level 4 gamer in this, and it goes to 4.5. So I don't know. I should let him tell this part of the case, but I will go on and read what I learned about Dungeons and Dragons when I researched it. And it first hit the market in 1974. So to your point earlier when you're speaking on it. And so it's kind of like a fantasy role-playing game, right? That's about as much as I knew about it. I think I garnered more information from watching Stranger Things when they have their kind of version of Dungeons and Dragons that they play. But basically what happens is the participant takes on a role of, somebody is the dungeon master. That's the referee, essentially the storyteller, kind of like the god of the game, if you will. And they form these parties who gather information and treasures, and they do battle and they explore and all these kinds of things. So the dungeon master, whomever that is in the game, is the one that creates their own storyline, their own adventure. Okay, so by 1981, I'm just going to give you a few brief bullet points on deaths that at the time were pinned on Dungeons and Dragons. Hence, when he first, I didn't even know about this, but in the pop culture segment at the beginning of the show, and he referenced that BADD acronym BAD, which was, what did you say? Be aware? Bothered about Dungeons and Dragons. Such an interesting, way
it is very
to say you don't like it, bothered about. But either way, so to that point, there's a reason that kind of came into play, and so we will weigh whether or not it is this fantasy game that is the problem, or is it the satanic panic that was so heightened in the 80s? Which one would it be? So in 1981, Dungeons and Dragons by then had reported 3 million plus players around the world, and 750,000 copies of the rules, for the game, were being sold annually by 1984. So 750,000 copies of the rules by 1984 were being sold. So that's huge. I also didn't know why, but didn't consider it to be worldwide.
I didn't really think about that either, but I didn't know anybody in any other countries back then when I was a kid either.
That's true.
So how would I know?
That's true. There was no internet. Wait a minute. So how'd they advertise?
Oh, it's word of mouth.
From here to China?
Word of mouth. You know what? Probably two things. I bet military. I bet soldiers who were stationed over there. Because it was still like younger people. And college students. I bet a lot of college students.
You think the college students that traveled abroad, or that just already lived somewhere else?
Well, both. No, yeah, traveled abroad or even went to school over there.
Okay, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was huge by 84. Okay, in this case, took place in 88. So in 1982, again, here are just a couple little bullet points. Actually, we're going to go back. So in 79, almost 10 years before Leith von Stein was murdered, there was a Michigan State University student named James Egbert III. I feel like that might be who you were referencing. Oh, no, yours was in 80-something, the bad, right? So in 79, this guy goes missing from his dorm after he had been playing Dungeons and Dragons. A PI found him a month later where he had actually killed himself, gunshot wound to the head. In 1982, 16-year-old Bink Pulling, who is an honor student and an avid D&D player in Virginia, left a note saying that his soul was no longer his soul after another player put a curse on him. So then he got his father's handgun, went out to the front lawn of their family home, and shot himself through the heart. 4 months after that suicide, 18-year-old Tony Gowan of Bardstown, Kentucky, walked into a local hobby shop and asked about this Dungeons and Dragons book that he had ordered. He gets into an argument with the 20-year-old clerk and impaled her with a medieval broadsword and killed her. So an idea of a D&D weapon, okay? In 84, 12-year-old Stephen Irwin, this may be who you're talking about, of Colorado, fatally shot his 15-year-old brother and then himself. Oh, God. Both boys were avid fans of Dungeons and Dragons and left suicide notes saying that death was the only way they could get out of the game.
Oh, boy.
Okay, so on May 26th of 85, 3 Alabama high school honor students. So there's a theme here as well, by the way. And this would be the same with Chris and his friends, but all these kids that I just noted, we're all looking at honor students, elevated academia here, okay? Playing Dungeons and Dragons, shot and killed a 26-year-old convenience store clerk named Missy Macon. In November of 85, 16-year-old David Ventiquatro of New York, who was the dungeon master in his ring, took a 20-gauge shotgun and killed his 11-year-old friend. And he claimed that in his D&D world, his role was to extinguish evil, and Martin was an evil demon who had to die.
Mm-hmm.
So how old was he? 16. So this is before the age of diagnosis of a lot of mental issues, right? So schizophrenias and things like this aren't diagnosed at these ages.
Yeah.
I'm not saying you can't have symptoms of, but it's pre-diagnosis. In 1987, Long Island teen Daniel Caston murdered his parents as they slept. He was an avid Dungeons and Dragons player, and he believed that he was under the control of a certain character called the Mind Flyer. So the game obviously is denying any true connection between itself and violence, but in 1983 it did go on and added like a warning label inside the game for players to not become too closely identified with their characters. But like all of the ones that we just listed, Chris, Leith's stepson, and his friends, his D&D friends, they actually played the game in steam tunnels at the school. So like underneath the school grounds, there were these tunnels, and they would play D&D there. They would also like take alcohol or acid. I think it started turning into a lot more acid before they would play out the scripts that they were given by the dungeon master, and they would role play often throughout the night. So the two friends that Chris had begun playing this game with so often and so avidly were boys named Bart Upchurch and a former student, Neil Henderson. Okay, so a tiny bit about Bart. Okay, let's see here. Let me see if I have his picture. If not, I will put it on. I do indeed. Look at me go. So here, if you are watching, you can see the names. If you're listening, I've just got a picture of all three of these guys up. It's a newspaper clipping, so it's an old faded black and white photo of Chris Pritchard, Bart Upchurch in the middle, and Neil Henderson there on the right. It is grainy, it's fuzzy, but that is the one that ran in the newspaper around the time of the murder. Okay, so Bart, here he looks like either Beavis or Butthead. Which one is it? Kind of a mixture of both?
Yeah.
Okay. So he was from, his name is actually James Bartlett Upchurch III, but he went by multiple names. We're just going to call him Bart to keep it easy. He'd grown up on a farm. He was just kind of like, he lived in a home environment of like the hippy dippy parents who like would have like pot smoking naked parties on the farm and just kind of wander around. It was almost like a perpetual Woodstock at his house, like no running water, no indoor plumbing until later on they renovated and did, but they had kind of a fairly large farmhouse out in a rural area where he grew up. But he loved to tell stories. He liked to be in charge. He enjoyed the game a lot. And at the time it was looked at as a positive outlet for kids with creativity and imagination, all these kinds of things. But they say that, if you won in this game, you weren't necessarily like a good guy. Okay, I don't know enough about the game to know how that works, but he was not troubled by that, and he liked to always be the dungeon master. Okay, so they say he liked the power, he liked the recognition for how it happened, and they would say that he almost liked it too much. And that might sound silly to go back and say that now, but maybe it just does kind of add to a little bit of his personality, something to note. Okay, so he was known as a loner. He had been labeled as weird. His teachers say that he was very obedient and respectful to them, even though he seemed to have no direction in life. But by the time he was a senior in high school, he was really into like advanced stages of play in D&D. I'm not going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons this whole time, but I'm just kind of giving you a little, kind of a backstory to this, because at the time, guys, this has actually been labeled like the Dungeons and Dragons murder. Like they've, people have gone so far as to call it that. And I'm definitely not doing that, but it is good to know some of these things, because it does seem that all three of these boys were fully, it's almost like if you binge watch a TV show, they couldn't stop thinking about it and they played it every second they got, to the point that they were flunking out of school. And about this time, Neil Henderson joins Bart's circle and this D&D group that they were forming. Okay, so Neil also came from a broken family, but instead he wasn't quite like Bart, who was kind of a loner. Neil was really, he enjoyed connection. He wanted to talk to people, but they say that his IQ was so incredibly high. It was 180. So that's an extremely high IQ. He was considered more than gifted. In fact, I believe it said that when he was in kindergarten, his teacher recommended that he be in third grade.
That happened to me too.
Well, that's why you play Dungeons and Dragons.
You stop it. Stop it. That did not happen.
You tell on yourself. So again, exceptionally high IQ. And so they say that he was bored in school. And, we hear of this kind of thing often, but he would turn to comic books. He would turn to, all the books he could find, but he was always kind of bored. I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? So evidently in 5th grade, he would start attending like 8th grade classes in the morning, but then they would have him go back to his elementary school in the afternoon just to make social connections with peers of his own age. So his mom did kind of struggle with worrying about that a little bit. So I don't even care to tell you too much more about him, other than just know that we learned later that Neil, while he was incredibly, incredibly intelligent, he did like social connection. He was also just arrogant, super arrogant. I think a common theme is these 3 boys were all pretty arrogant, all had money and had intelligence, and just kind of threw it away to the tune of drugs and then ultimately Dungeons and Dragons and almost failing out of school. So Bart, though, he's one that does have a history where the other 2 don't. He did have a history of some run-ins with the law. So like back in 86, I think. Yeah. So like 2 years before the murder, Bart had actually been with a group of kids that had been hiking and camping. They decide they don't actually like that it's cold outside. So they find an abandoned, well, I say abandoned, it was just a currently unoccupied cabin in the woods, decide to break into it. While they're not just using it for shelter. They decide they're going to just steal things from it. So that the original intent was not to steal. Then they're in there and they're like, oh, they're using up. They're kind of like, it's like Goldilocks and the 3 Bears. They're kind of using all the stuff. Decide they're going to take I've read computers. I don't know how many computers there were in 1986 in this cabin in the woods, but TVs. And so they take cases of beer, wine, a television, 2 clocks, a pair of binoculars, among other things. So evidently Bart said that he admitted his guilt, but they say that he worried about like the outcome, but had no remorse in the sense of he was always embarrassed. So whenever he got caught, he would just be kind of like more embarrassed at people finding out that he had done it, not that he wishes he hadn't done it. Yeah. And so later, some people will talk toward the fact that maybe that was part of his, almost narcissism or ego, that side of things. So that's Bart. So all the kids have come together at this point. We know NC State, Dungeons and Dragons, and they're hanging out. But actually, Bart had not been hanging out with Chris for that long. It had only been a few, just a few months that they'd known each other, and just not very long that they'd been playing this game together. I think to the tune of like weeks. Okay. What was that? My voice just cracked. I'm going through puberty.
Like Peter Brady.
Like Peter Brady. Just call me Peter Brady. So by the end of his sophomore year, Neil had flunked out of NC State, so his scholarship was revoked. He had to move off campus. But Bart was back in school for summer session and was hanging up posters for new D&D players around the campus. He had a promise of free beer. He'd write, free beer, come play D&D with me. At this time, Neil was working at a local retail store, but he would schedule his hours around when they were projected to play the game. Okay, so this was absolutely their first thought, their priority. And also taking this summer session, remember this murder happened in July, was Chris Pritchard, okay, Bonnie and Lee's son. So ultimately, it's going to be Neil that breaks. So if you remember, we don't have any charges yet. So the murder happened, and then the cops have been working this case. There wasn't a lot to go off of. That hunter or that farmer really helped him out with that fire he showed him and pointed him in the right direction. And then this inheritance really kind of gave him some clues. Okay. So they decide that they're going to talk to Neil. They said that he was vulnerable. They said he was very nervous. They said that they played on a hunch, and they said that they kind of fib a little bit and say that they knew that Chris was involved and they felt like Neil knew something and it was just going to be better for him to go on and tell them what he knew. And did he tell them? So they say that he spilled it immediately and he told them more than they could have imagined to find out. He said that within a week or so of meeting Chris, so Neil had just met Chris a week or so prior to the conversation they're about to have. They start to discuss future plans, and Chris mentioned that it would only be a matter of time before he was wealthy. Remember, they said that he was kind of a braggart, right? So he would throw around the fact that his parents had money. So Chris tells his friends that his family has millions, including multiple houses and cars. And Neil says that someone had made the suggestion. He says he can't conveniently remember who, but someone makes the suggestion that Chris should just go ahead and off his parents for the money. That once they were dead and Chris inherited money, he could buy a house in the woods for all of them to live in, and there they could spend their days doing drugs and playing Dungeons and Dragons. Neil says that he assumed it was all a joke, that they're just shooting the bull. And then in July of 1988, Chris and Bart tell Neil, right, that they've come up with a plan for Chris to inherit early money by killing his parents. So he's kind of continually maintaining a slight bit of innocence. Like, I kind of knew they were talking about it, didn't really believe they'd do it. The two of them came to me saying that they had formulated a plan to do this, right? So he's kind of keeping himself a bit distanced from the actual event every time he tells this story. So evidently the first plan that Bart and Chris had come up with, per Neil's account, was Chris sedating his family with sleeping pills and then setting the house on fire. Okay. But what we find out is that when Chris was there that weekend, the weekend prior to the murder, he had tried. He evidently came to the home armed with handfuls of sleeping pills that he crushed up. He tells his mother, oh, this is so gross because it's so premeditated. He tells his mom to just relax, that he's going to cook. And he proceeds to turn the grill on. And they had like a little ampule, like a little glass fuse that he was going to use to then ignite and get this house caught on fire. Okay. But he crushes up the sleeping pills and actually puts them in with the hamburger meat and serves the family. Then breaks off this fuse and uses the hood of the car to like break off this little fuse. And in fact, by the way, later detectives prove this to be true. They actually find part of this little ampule later on after this story's been told and come out. But his account is that on Friday night he tried it, but they didn't succumb. I don't know if the pills got altered somehow in the grilling process. But they didn't, in fact, fall asleep and pass out like he had planned. So that was their original idea. Like, knock them out like that with sleeping pills and then set the house on fire. But when that didn't work, Chris also started thinking that he didn't like the idea of him being there when something happened. So this is when he came up with the idea of this alibi to be back at NC State. So he just needed one of them to do it. If he was at NC State, that wouldn't implicate any of them, and easy peasy. Okay. They'd be off the hook. And so Chris decided that it would be best if they set up like a home invasion. And they say that, or Neil will say when detectives are talking to him, that Angela, the sister, had not really been talked about much in this process. It's all about killing the parents to get that inheritance. But he did say that at one point Chris had said that he was okay with splitting the inheritance and that unless she woke up. So if she wakes up that night, she would have to be taken out. If not, he'd be okay with, the splitting the inheritance with her. So it'd be in her best interest to sleep. So keep that in mind as well. He also told Bart and Neil that the inheritance was around $10 million. And that's simply not the case at all. So according to Neil, Bart pretty quickly agreed to be the actual killer. Okay. So we have, Dungeon Master Bart decides he's going to do it. So it was Neil's job to be the driver. He's going to drive Chris the son's car to Little Washington. So Bart's driver's license had already been revoked like multiple times. So they didn't want to risk Bart being pulled over and arousing any suspicion there or any kind of hangups with law enforcement in that way. So Neil was told that he was going to get paid either $2,000 or $20,000. He couldn't remember. Okay. $2,000 or $20,000 for chauffeuring Bart to and from the house. Chris drew them a map of the neighborhood, that infamous map that we found right in that burn pile by the farmer. And the map showed not only the von Stein house, but neighboring houses with dogs that might bark. You've got to understand that Bart and Neil were not familiar with this neighborhood at all. They lived 2 hours away around NC State, in the Raleigh area. So they weren't familiar with they didn't come hang out too much at Chris's or in Chris's home. So the day before the murder, Neil says that Chris told him that his parents were about to disinherit him over his poor school performance. Okay. And so that's what he and Leith had been butting heads about. So Neil said that he did not know that when this was supposed to take place. So he, again, is kind of acting as though he was a little out of the loop. I kind of knew I was supposed to drive. They didn't really give me the details all the time. Okay. So he didn't know until the day of, which was Sunday, right? July 24th of 88. That's when Bart shows up with Chris's car keys and tells Neil to meet him in the French parking lot behind the dorms that night around midnight. Remember, Chris couldn't find his keys, couldn't get to his car, and had to have the campus police drive him to his mother in the hospital the night he heard about it. Well, here we go. It's because these keys have been lent out. So Bart has Chris's keys, tells Neil to come meet him. Neil said that Bart had put black shoe polish on a pair of white batting gloves, like baseball gloves, and put black shoe polish on the bat that he was going to use. I guess he's trying to keep everything dark. But smelly, right? Sticky, smelly, you would think?
Yeah.
Evidently, per Neil, Bart said that the bat should, quote, get the job done on both of Chris's parents. And just in case, though, Chris had purchased a hunting knife as a backup. Okay. So according to Neil, Bart was excited and hyperactive. He was almost in a manic state on the 2-hour drive to Little Washington, for the actual mission of the murder. So Neil said that even while they drove there, he was under the impression that they were only going to commit a burglary, that they were going to get the jewelry that Chris said was in the house. So he said that even when they pulled off where Chris had told them to go, and Bart changed into all black clothing, he smeared black shoe polish around his face, he put a dark ski mask on. Neil says he still had no idea that people were going to get hurt. So I'm going to let you guys come to your conclusion on that. Okay. Neil told the detectives that he waited in the car and Bart went off with a key that Chris had given him. Okay. So he's just kind of sitting in the car waiting. Bart leaves to go to the home. Chris had given them a key to get into the house. Remember that. He wasn't sure how long Bart was gone when he, recollects this with detectives. But when he returned, he says that Bart told Neil, he said, I did it. I actually did it. I've never seen that much blood in my life. I hope I never see that much blood again. But again, he had that almost excited, manic phase about him. He said that he said at first he saw Bart's hands had blood on them. Later, he takes that back. He doesn't say that he saw the blood. Okay. So it was Bart who then directs Neil where to go on and dispose of these items. It was the clothing, the weapons, and the map. And Bart set it all on fire just for that farmer to find it mere hours later. Okay. So Neil goes on and drives them both back to Raleigh. They left Chris's car in the same lot. He said he put Chris's keys on a high shelf in a bathroom. Which is where Bart told him to put him. But again, that's probably why Chris could not find his keys the next day to drive to meet up with detectives and his mother. So he said that he had spent the last nearly year. You guys, this is almost a year later that, this interview has taken place. He said he had spent all those months trying to forget it. He said he had been depressed ever since. He said he felt atonement by telling it all. But he said he was terrified of Bart Upchurch and Chris Pritchard, and that's why he had not yet come forward prior to now. So then on June 15th of 89, remember this murder took place in July of 88, Bart was arrested for the murder of Leith von Stein and the attack on Bonnie. He refused to say anything and lawyered up, right off the rip. Which we talk about this. I mean, lawyers will say get a lawyer. Lawyers will say if you're innocent, get a lawyer. They're wanting to question you about murder. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that as being on the other side of things as
law
enforcement?
people have cleared themselves by simply talking to a detective. When their name comes up, or when someone says, "Hey, I think this was the dude that was there in the car," or the guy,
Mm-hmm.
So people have come in, sat down, and been like, "I didn't do this. I can tell you where I was," and they clear their name without getting a lawyer, without doing any of that. So I go back and forth.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, I'm not saying if somebody says they want a lawyer, they're guilty. I'm just saying there's all, so many people are told that. They themselves have gotten jammed up where they're like, "I'm not talking, get me a lawyer," and then their name stays in an investigation and potentially get implicated in other things, peripheral charges and stuff.
Okay. We'll talk about a polygraph in a minute. So they tried to keep Bart's arrest a little quiet. They didn't want to tip Chris off. So by now, Neil has told them everything. He's probably sitting prettiest right now. Okay. Mm-hmm. And then they've got Bart, who's obtained a lawyer, and they're about to go toward Chris, right? But a friend of Bonnie's had actually found out about Bart's arrest and called Bonnie to let her know. And so Bonnie let Chris know. Chris had been living with her for this year. He had left school for, quote, psychiatric reasons soon after the murder of Leith and had moved back home and moved back in with Bonnie. And so Chris spent Thursday night at a friend's house. And then on Friday, they come to Bonnie's home with a warrant for Chris's arrest. So Chris does what Bart does. He lawyers up before he goes back home. He's immediately taken into custody. So they say that, on their drive back to Beaufort County, though, when we talk about this, too, it's kind of interesting what people choose to talk about, that he was chatting the police up about what you spoke on, the tornadoes that had actually gone through Winston-Salem and Wake Forest. He did not speak about the charges against him. He acted certain he was not going to be under arrest for them and didn't want to talk about them at all. So then on Thursday of June 20th, Neil was arrested in Raleigh, but this was no surprise to him, right? He's the one who's laid it all out there for him. He was actually waiting on the detectives when they got there. He knew when they would be coming. He had been very cooperative, so I think that they were letting him in on, their next moves with him. So by December, there had been a plea deal with Neil and his attorney. So remember, Neil, per his account, was solely the getaway driver. He will say that while they talked about a murder, they talked about a plan. They actually very specifically talked about two different plans that they were going to do. They had cache locations, burn locations, changing of clothes locations, a key to enter the house, a hunting knife, a bat. He still says he really thought at the end of the day, the only thing that was going to take place was a burglary. Okay. But either way you cut it, even if he had knowledge of the information, he did not come up with the mission. He did not promise goods and ask for it to take place. And he did not actually commit the murder per his account. So out of the three, he does kind of have a smaller hand dealt in all of this. And so he did plead in exchange for pleading guilty to felony charges of aiding and abetting second-degree murder and aiding and abetting assault with a deadly weapon and intent to kill. They did drop all other charges potentially that they would have had. And he was going to testify against Bart and Chris. Okay, so that was kind of their exchange. So they said that the sentencing would actually be left to the discretion of the judge. He could get as much as life plus 20 years for all of those charges. And on December 5th, there was a plea agreement accepted by the judge. And Neil was allowed to return to Danville with his family. And we'll talk about his, while he awaited sentencing. So we'll talk about that. So trials were set to start in January. Chris pled guilty. He agreed to testify against Bart after he spent 9 hours telling his story. So evidently there were some inconsistencies, but for the most part, Chris's story did pretty much back up Neil's story, that Bart was the murderer, and kind of all of the things that led up to this. Obviously, this was not great for Bart's defense, but he still refused to admit his guilt. He still was trying to seek a plea deal separately from the state, and he was going to go to trial. Or he ultimately was going to go to trial. So his trial began on January 8th. And he had mainly women. So 8 women and 4 men were on his jury. Either way, they all said that death would be his punishment, and he was convicted. He was convicted of the murder and sentenced ultimately to death. So they also had Bonnie speak. Okay, so she talks about everything that happened. Chris actually took the stand himself. So leading up to this, guys, Bonnie and Angela, both at the request of detectives, did take and did both pass a polygraph. Now, Bonnie's score, don't quote me on this, I believe was like whatever, the way they scored this one was like, let's say 5 or 6.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right? 5. Either way, whatever the scoring was for that particular polygraph, they had just changed the way they scored it. So had she taken that same polygraph months prior, it would have come back as inconclusive results. So let's say that her mom scored a 9 or a 10 and she scored like a 5. Okay. Angela did, the daughter. So interesting. It's whatever. She passed, but just something to know. And then Chris never took one. It was, some sources will say he refused. He did refuse, but it was at advice of counsel. He was really the one they wanted, obviously, to take a polygraph, but his counsel was like, yeah, we're not going to be doing that. Chris, while taking the stand, does go on and recount his relationship with Leith, that he did have trouble with drugs, that he continued to partake in cocaine, LSD, ecstasy. He said that he had an obsession with Dungeons and Dragons. He goes on to tell them the murder plot. This is the first time the public is really kind of hearing all of this. And it's also the first time Angela, his sister, is hearing her brother say that if she'd awoken that night, it was fine for her to be murdered as well. Okay, so she didn't necessarily know that that was his instruction. So they say that she sat in the courtroom and heard him say that, and then showed no outward signs of emotion, no change in her expression when she heard that. Chris admitted that he bought the knife at a Kmart just days before the murder, and that he only knew that the knife was going to be used. He didn't know anything about the baseball bat. So Bart came up with the baseball bat. Okay. So Chris said that when he learned that his mom had survived the assault, he was, quote, happy. He also said that he did have remorse over the attack and he was thoroughly disgusted and blah, 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 blah. So only Chris, Bart, and Neil were the ones to conspire, right? But Neil was asked why he had gotten involved at all in this plot to kill them. And he responded that he had poor self-esteem and he was desperate to make friends and fit in. And when shown a photograph, Neil was shown a color photograph of Leith, like at the crime scene. And remember, I told you they said just bathed in blood. It was a very, very bloody scene. They say that Neil did tear up. And he said that not only did he not do that, but he could not have done that. In saying this to you, when Neil walked in, so the two bodies are very different. Neil was kind of a stockier, round-faced guy. Let me see if I have that picture. It's not a great one of him. I'll put more on Instagram on Andrea Up Late. Yeah, that's not going to really show him well. But Neil was like I said, kind of pudgier, rounder guy, stockier build. Okay. And he was the driver per his account. Bart was a very slender build, skinny guy, smaller in frame, kind of like Chris. The way Bonnie describes what she saw was a bit of a larger guy. When Neil walked into the courtroom to testify, they say that Bonnie, and she will say the same, gasped and almost had to stand and leave the courtroom because she had such a reaction to seeing Neil walk, because that reminded her so similarly of the person that was in her bedroom. And she did not feel that way when she saw Bart on the stand. She, in fact, didn't believe anything Neil said, and she thought for sure he had. Now, she could be wrong, right? But she thought for sure he had to be the one to commit this act. So it wasn't until Bart actually kind of tells what happened, that she had to believe that. All right. So they say that nobody looked at Bart. We'll go back to Bart when they give him his guilty verdict. Under North Carolina law, they had to decide the punishment for Bart. And like I said, it was going to be the gas chamber or life in prison. And they picked death. So let's get through here. So Angela, get this. Okay. So the sister, she sat through all of Neil's testimony, the getaway driver. Okay. She heard all of the details of her brother's story when he was on stand, and like she heard all the details of the murder, the pictures, the crime scene pictures, all of the things that had happened, that she potentially could have been a victim, that her mother was obviously very severely attacked. Right. And they say that the whole time, and this is multiple accounts, that she looked almost like to the point of disinterest, like boredom during the case. But when she heard that Bart had been sentenced to death, she burst into tears. So we will chat about that. Neil Henderson was sentenced to 40 years. So that was the driver, right? For aiding and abetting second-degree murder, and 6 years for aiding and abetting assault with a deadly weapon. And he was sent to Harnett County Correctional Institution. So they say that he could get a study release. Either way, he served double that, and he, get out as little as 5 years, but he served double that. So he served about 10 years and was released in December of 2000. He went on to manage a restaurant in North Carolina. Neil didn't have any infractions or any write-ups the whole time he was in prison. Didn't have really any issues. So Bart did file an appeal, and they did eventually change his sentence to life instead of death. So he was serving life in prison. And then Bart was a bit different than Neil in the sense that he had multiple infractions: theft, disobeying orders, substance possession, you name it. He's been getting in a lot of trouble in prison. So we got Judge Watts was the one who was the sentencing judge for Chris, and he imposed the maximum sentence, which was life plus 20. And so evidently this is an interesting side note. The judge stepped in a side room with Bonnie so she could kind of, she's playing both. She's the victim and she's the mother of the accused. So she tells him that she wanted to talk to him about her son and kind of plead with him. But Angela, the daughter, the sister, did not go in there. She was asked to go and did not want to go in there. So mom, right? So Bonnie stays in touch with Chris. Sorry, guys, I don't want to say the wrong name. Mom stays in touch with Chris, and pretty much immediately upon his incarceration, she goes to visit him every day. She was spending all this time with him. But listen to this. The reason he had seemed so kind of unbothered and not too worried about a bad sentence, which he did wind up serving some time. He was actually released, guys, from the prison in 1997 and moved back in with his mother. So he only served, 7 years or so, Chris? His inheritance that the murder took place over wanting to gain this inheritance. Well, Bonnie received the inheritance because Leith died and she was still alive. And then she used that money on a really stellar defense team for Chris. An odd form of irony. So he got the inheritance he wanted, just in a very different way than you would have thought, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy?
I couldn't do that. I mean, not once it's all out and there's no, I don't know, maybe she thought he never was guilty, but.
Oh, she did.
Man.
I mean, he told her he was. He told her he was. And, it's one of those, so now she says, she and her son, she's still alive. She and her son are close. I've watched interviews. He doesn't live too far from us.
Mhm.
So I found him on social media. So we'll see what happens. I think he likes to talk. He has since gone on to I don't know. I'm not going to judge someone's heart. I don't know. He says he's a born again Christian. It happens often in and outside of prison. Either way, he does work with like at-risk youth, and he works with people transitioning from prison back into mainstream life. He's been doing it a lot. If you go to my on my Instagram page on Andrea Upload on my story right now, I've got just like a 5-second clip of him talking. And this is an interview from like a decade ago, but it's him kind of talking about his work now. I've seen some of his comments and replies to people on Twitter. And it's kind of interesting because people will be like, oh, he's sick. He should still be in prison. And he'll come back with, you're right. That was a terrible thing I did. I can't do it worse. I did it. I can't say I didn't do it. I also don't ever want anything like that in my life again. All I can do is try to not be that person ever again. And I mean, he makes a good point in that sense. I mean, you've interviewed people on your show who, in the past have done some things that they, to say not proud of is an understatement, right? Things they're very ashamed of, but have gone on to try to do their best to move forward. And so who's to say? So to the point of the mom using the inheritance or a chunk of it to pay his legal fees, I think that like, now I could see that, right? She says, I've spent time with him. I've seen him. I visited him every day in jail. I saw him grow. I saw him change. Now I can see it. But at the time of the trial, not then. I mean, you've not had that opportunity for the time to go by to see him be remorseful and grow and change as a person, right? He, at last I saw, he lived in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. But just a couple of questions before we wrap up, okay? I just said before we started the show, this is going to be a short one.
Yeah, you did.
I sure did.
I still have a burning question. I'm not going to ask it now.
You're not going to ask it at all?
Who drew the map? Did you say who drew the map?
Chris.
Okay. Yeah. That's right. He had to draw it for them.
He had to draw it again.
I got you.
Yeah, Chris drew it.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
The guy who lived there.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to get much on food autopsy science in the sense that the biggest one we covered was the Hendricks family axe murder, and that we got into the idea of studying food contents in the stomach to determine how long someone had been deceased. And we learned that when they used that in a trial at that case, it was a very big piece of the prosecution or the defense, however that one went, I forget now. But and we've later come back to realize that it is not close to an exact science. However, I will say that this may or may not matter, so take it for what it's worth. But during Leith's autopsy, evidently the coroner found undigested chicken and rice in his stomach. I guess per science, rice and chicken are fairly easily digestible. And Bonnie says that she and Leith had eaten dinner around 8 or 9 o'clock that night before bed. And so at the time, the Emmy is saying that they think that this stuff should have been much more digested by 3 or 4 in the morning. We've learned, though, between metabolism, different medications, stress and duress, different things like that, our bodies all digest food very differently. So you really kind of can't use that as a good timeline frame. So listen to this. We told you that Bonnie had that visceral reaction when she saw Neil for the first time. And some experts believe that 2 people were involved in Leith's murder. Bonnie had described the bad guy, right? Now, granted, she did not have on her glasses, and it is the dark, and she saw him briefly, but she says that he was big and bulky with a neck that sat right on his shoulders. This is much more in line with a visual of Neil. Not so much when you look at Bart. Particularly back then. And so they're saying unless Bart padded himself up a ton that night, I don't know. We didn't find like padded clothing in the fire debris, I would say. So also experts thought that Leith was struck by an instrument wielded by someone who was right-handed based on the trajectory of the spatter, of the orientation of the wounds. They can figure all this kind of thing out. Bart was left-handed.
But did he swing a bat right-handed?
Oh, I don't know, but but he also had, now Leith didn't have as many bat bludgeons. He had the one to the back of his skull, but he primarily had multiple stab wounds.
Okay, that's right.
So you know what I'm saying? Like she got the bat, he did get the bat, but most of his injuries and his fatal ones were the bleeding out, was that stab wound. But that's a great clarification. But he was left-handed, so that's tough. I mean, I can see a bat. Like, I cut with scissors with my right hand, and I do everything else in my left hand. That's because my kindergarten teacher thought I was a witch and wouldn't let me cut with my left hand. Or it was something like that. I don't know. So I had to learn to cut with my right hand, but I'm a left-handed person. So, yes, he could be left-handed but swing a bat right-handed. Either way, that's kind of moot because really Leith died from stab wounds. In Neil's statement, the getaway driver, right, to the police, and in his testimony, he said that he got nervous while he was waiting for Bart to return. Remember, they're in this new neighborhood, this new subdivision, a place 2 hours from where they're from. He says he got nervous and left their prearranged meeting spot, okay, and just kind of drove without purpose. He's just driving aimlessly because he's very nervous. But apparently Bart found him in that wherever it was that he drove off to, in that new, unknown location to Bart. And it was dark, and this is an unfamiliar area to Bart. So that's just something to consider.
I bet they had an interesting conversation. Like, why aren't you where you were supposed to be?
I think the point here is, was he actually anywhere other than inside that house? Neil. That's what they're trying to kind of get at, right? And I'm not sold. I'm not super sure on this one, but anyway, either way. So Chris testifies that this is interesting. So he tells them that he gives Bart the key to the back door of the home, right? Bonnie told authorities, though, that the porch had been redone and the back door was rekeyed with a new lock, and the key that Chris had no longer worked. Yet the killer had managed to enter the home, and they don't think it was by way of that glass that was broken, because it would be tough to reach the door lock from there. So Chris always said that Angela, his sister, knew nothing of this murder plot, but after he had been convicted, about a year had gone by, and there was a conversation he had had with her on July 23rd of 1988. So the day prior to the invasion and the murder, okay? Chris had a conversation with his sister, Angela, and he was asked about it, and he didn't really have any answers. He said that he had been on his way back to Raleigh, to write this term paper. And he'd stopped by a friend's house where Angela was. He had taken her aside for a short private conversation, but when pressed about it later, he said he did not even recall stopping off or having seen her or having had a conversation at all. But other people have said that, like, no, he stopped into this house and talked to her.
Yeah.
I like to confuse you.
I get confused.
I know. We talked about this case a little bit before and just kind of ideas on this, but so Chris, right? He denied that Angela, his sister, ever knew Bart, his friend Bart. But this actually contradicts Angela's own statement that she and Bart had met a few times when she traveled to NC State to visit Chris and some of the girlfriends. So she says that she actually recalls meeting Bart as early as January at a Def Leppard concert. And this would have been 5 months before Chris claims that he met Bart. Okay? And he's saying that Angela had not ever known Bart. And she's like, oh, no, I knew him before Chris did. She also said that her relationship with Bart was more like friends rather than acquaintances. But Bart himself, Bart the man, says that they actually had been involved, whether he was right or not, in a sexual relationship, that Bart had been in love with Angela. And while he was incarcerated, Neil, the getaway driver, told author Joe McGinnis, who wrote a book we're going to talk about, that Bart told him, quote, finally, I've met a girl I'd like to marry. If you recall at the trial, while they say Angela seemed bored and disinterested the whole time, even during the vivid details of her stepfather's murder and the fact that she could have been, they talk about her being a potential victim, her brother thinking it's okay if she dies, right? That's their story anyway. She burst into tears when Bart was sentenced to death. But Chris is saying she didn't know him, and they're both saying that they knew each other. Angela always said she slept through the bludgeoning. Okay? Again, it was right next to her bedroom. They actually shared a wall.
Okay. Well,
okay.
All right.
What?
No. Go ahead.
Okay. So we know that hours earlier, Bonnie knocked on Angela's door and asked her to turn her radio down because Bonnie could hear Angela's music through her walls. Angela slept through the murder, but evidently, like I noted earlier, she slept through police, EMS, and ambulance. They came down the street. They came up the driveway, into the house, up the stairs. And they say that she had they, meaning the detectives. This isn't more like hearsay or circumstantial stuff. They say that she had, there was no panic or fear when a police officer woke her up. And I thought this the first time I read this, that he goes in her door, tells her to wake up. Something's happened at home, get clothes on. And I read everywhere, like she did it with no question. And I'm thinking, if I'm awoken in the middle of the night to an officer at my bed telling me to get up and get my clothes on, that something's happening, I'm probably running around my bed screaming in circles.
Yeah.
I wouldn't even know how to find my pants. You know what I'm saying? Like, what you're going to have to tell me what happened. And I just thought that to me was kind of one of the more jarring details of the story, was that specific little area of it right there. Yeah, that's weird. Let that one sink in, baby. Think about that, because that's a lot. Anyway, so some investigators say that they don't know how she could have slept through it. Lee screaming. And so Bonnie says that he screamed more than a dozen times. When they were asking how long his screams took place, she said he had to have at least screamed a dozen times. Remember, that's what Bonnie says woke her up. Again, she doesn't get woken up by jostling on the bed or by getting hit with a bat. She wakes up to her husband screaming. So some people think that she might have actually, Angela, gone downstairs to let Bart in. Okay. If you're in the camp that she had anything to do with this and that she herself wanted some of this inheritance, remember, Chris talks constantly about lending Bart a key, but we find out that Chris's key was out of date for that lock. It had been rekeyed, okay, with a new lock when that was renovated. And the slashes to the screen don't match up with the breaking in the glass. And the glass that was broken, you wouldn't be able to really access the knob or the lock to the door, but the door itself had 9 panels of glass that you could just break one of those out and grab it, right? So some people are in the camp that Angela actually went downstairs and let Bart in and goes back upstairs to feign sleep. So they think that maybe she had been told that Bart was only going to be burglarizing the house, and that maybe she didn't even know that murder was on the menu until it happened or until after the fact. But the ice in her glass of water on her nightstand, North Carolina summer, okay, and this would have been more than 4 hours after when she said she went to bed. Okay, so I've looked into this a little bit. It's actually, if Silly's in the chats right now.
She is.
Well, the three of us, Brian, myself, and Silly, were in like a little group chat earlier, and I was just fully slammed at work, so busy. And I had a little like squirrel moment and quickly typed on that chat instead of one just to Brian that said about ice melting and the time it takes to melt. And she was like, I don't think I want to know what y'all are talking about. And I was like, what's the case tonight? So actually, that's what it is. But if you want to know about it, it takes a single ice cube in cold water about 15 minutes to melt. So I could assume that if you have 4 or 5 ice cubes, it's going to take longer than 15 minutes. Most certainly, it's not going to take more than 4 hours.
Yeah.
And she says that she had gone to bed. That's the piece of the puzzle we didn't know before, when she'd gone to bed. But even then, it was kind of like, well, goodness, even if she'd have gone to bed 25 minutes before this, I don't see that glass having ice in it. This was 1988. I'm sorry. She might have had tinfoil wrapped around something. Like, it wasn't a Yeti.
Yeah, you're right.
This wasn't like double wall insulated, these cups that we have now that hold on to ice forever. It was probably like a something glass from a Tupperware party or glass. Mm-hmm. Yeah. At best. That's all. What if I just end every show with that's all? We just cut off. Yeah.
Let that sink in.
Let that sink in, baby. I don't know. I think so. When I said that this one is solved with some exceptions, these exceptions are, do you think Angela had anything to do with it? A little bit. We didn't really talk about her history, but she had been kind of dating some guys that were not going down the best path. This doesn't implicate her in collusion with murder, right? But some boys that had been a little rough, getting into some drugs herself around the same time Chris had been getting into drugs, but she was only like 16, 17. Some issues in that sense, kind of in and out of the house, bouncing around with friends. I don't like the conversation that he doesn't seem to remember he had with his sister the day before the murder.
All those, probably 3 or 4 factors right there. During an interview, should be able to sneeze.
There it is.
You should be able to explain that. Like the ice stuff.
Every time Brian sneezes, a conviction gets overturned. What?
That's terrible. Terrible.
A sentence gets reduced.
But all of that, I mean, that can be explained.
The electric chair goes buzz. I'm done. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Or when you ask somebody that question and they go, that pregnant kind of pause, that may be one of those.
Yeah.
Like the ice. I mean, whoever documented that, that's pretty solid.
The ice door, and her not being, the door's weird.
Yeah.
That's I consider that strong evidence. But the ice and her not being, for me, it's always just like the emotional side of things, in the sense that, like, that makes zero sense to me that at 17 years, at any age, I mean, if you're 60, but if you're 17 years old and you wake up to a police officer at your bedside at 4 o'clock in the morning telling you to get dressed, that something has happened, and she showed no emotion and got dressed without any questions.
Yeah.
And she had never been deemed or painted to be like this wallflower, shy girl either, you know?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I guess it's Angela, and it's also, wait, does Neil have a bigger piece in this than we? He was charged. Hang on. He was charged. You can talk if you want.
I was just going to simply say in 1982, a movie called Mazes and Monsters was made about a fictitious game, but it was like based on what Dungeons and Dragons were doing at the time, the games.
We were actually told about this case from a friend of ours in the neighborhood who grew up in that area, in the Little Washington area, and so remembered when this happened. Actually, I think he said his father and the what? Well, just that there had been acquaintances, like there had been mutual acquaintances with the family around the time that this took place. So something that, like, I was like, oh, I've never heard of the case, but of course everyone in the area had heard about it. You can imagine that's a kind of case that would be in a big town. That's a brutal murder that everyone would hear about, but in a small town like that.
Yeah.
I'm trying to, I wasn't gonna out anybody.
Tom Hanks was in the movie Mazes and Monsters, 1982.
I don't know how I'm feeling about that dude these days.
Well, I'm just saying that was the beginning of his movie career.
I'm trying to see because
Dungeons and Dragons. Kevin Peter Hall played him.
Speak up! I'm making rustling noises.
For all the nerds out there with me, Kevin Peter Hall is the guy who played the Predator, the actual monster in the movie Predator. He's like 7'2". He played some kind of giant monster thing in it. But yeah.
Well, I was trying to see exactly because I forgot. I think it had to do with conspiring to. Yes, here we go. So Neil was sentenced to 40 years for aiding and abetting second-degree murder and 6 years for aiding and abetting assault with a deadly weapon, with them to run concurrently. So that's not the same thing. Aiding and abetting is not the same thing as murder, right? So it wouldn't be double jeopardy. Like, he could be tried. Could he be tried for murder? Aiding and abetting.
I don't know about that. Maybe, but I don't know about that.
Do we have lawyers in the house?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I don't know how to answer it. And I'm sure people are listening, screaming at the speaker or their YouTube. My gut would be like, but I don't know.
Aiding and abetting, I would not think would be considered synonymous with murdering, with the act of.
So if you charge somebody with conspiracy to commit armed robbery and they're sentenced or whatever, and then you come back and go, oh, we found out they actually did the robbery too, could you then charge them for the robbery? We're talking about the same thing, right?
Yeah. Meaning if we find out, if they want to come forward and charge him with the murder, like that he also was with Bart, that this was a two-man job. I say that they can. I just became a lawyer right now. Okay. And I say that they can.
Okay. I feel like they can too. I don't know. It's just that. But I'm not a lawyer either. So,
I just think,
you're right.
I don't know.
I don't either.
We've got, the only other thing I was going to say to that, and we got to go, but is that, the whole idea of Dungeons and Dragons, do I blame that game? No, I don't. I think that's silly. I don't blame the game for the murder. Now, do people get fixated? Do certain personalities get more fixated? Mm-hmm. Do the aid of psychedelics, you know what I'm saying, make all of this? And the one thing I was thinking is that, but now, I don't know. How much of a case do we have for that? Because now we have a lot of people who blame these single shooter video games on things that kids are doing.
Yeah.
This is before we had any of that. So this is one of the first things that we had that would be fully immersive. Mm-hmm. You fully feel like you're doing this thing that you're role playing. Mm-hmm. So now it sounds really silly to be like, but it's Dungeons and Dragons. But then that's what there wasn't other stuff like that.
Yeah. I think when you look at total, what'd you say, 740,000 copies or something?
Of the rules, it was more than 3 million people playing it.
Right. So I know 3 million people. Yeah, you've got these outliers. And also they did a study with the suicide rate. And because people were making allegations that kids that were playing Dungeons
well, that's pretty much all of what the ones I read. There were some murders. Most of them were suicides.
Yeah, but that actually, I apologize, but the study showed Dungeons and Dragons players actually had a lower suicide rate compared to their peers.
Probably so.
It's the same when you talk about active shooter and people saying the video games. Yet you've got millions of people playing the video games.
Agreed.
And they're not.
I think the difference here, and I'm definitely not blaming the game. Mm-hmm. I think the difference that someone would articulate here is that in the cases that I listed off the bullet points of the mostly suicide, some murder, and then this one as well, the people who left the notes and who have done the thing say it. They've said it was the only way out of the game, or I couldn't stop thinking about it, or it felt, and Chris will say now that now he's like, no, it wasn't the game, but also I did fully feel like I was in fantasy world. So if you add to it by say, oh, I was tripping on LSD and I'm now this character and then I'm devising this plan. Now you still got to come through to the part where the plan is executed when you're potentially sober and it's been a few days and you're not in the game.
Yeah.
But I could see where there's, I don't know, some nuances here and there. I'm not saying.
Well, yes. So I guess that's what I would say. An active shooter, let's say, who is into a certain shooting game. Yes, it can influence them. They still want to do the crime, but it's as if they're kind of living that fantasy out. But But by playing the game doesn't cause them to be that way. Yes. I think they're drawn to that game because they're already having
that. I can see.
Yeah, same thing like horror movies. When people are talking about horror movies,
Mm-hmm.
which they're usually not good anyway. But anyway, enough of that.
When I had Dexter Pitts on as a co-host, and we were
Uh-huh.
talking about the Beaver family murders, which is horrific, and I don't know if I can
Yeah.
ever cover that again. But I tried to do closed captioning for some sound bites with him to put some reels up and stuff on Instagram and YouTube, and I couldn't because he is so deeply from the South, that man,
Mhm.
that when he would say things more than once, he said that the home that those murders took place in looked like the Amityville horror house.
Mhm.
And every time the closed captioning recorded it as whorehouse. And
I try to slow down.
So
when I
just
say
then
it
when you were
too,
trying to
yeah.
like enunciate,
Yeah.
I always think about that. Cause I'm like, dang it, Piz, I can't even use this stuff every time.
Yeah.
Oh, well, you guys drop me a line. Let me know what you think. I'll put this up as always on Andrea Upload on Instagram. If you are watching on YouTube now, thank you for being with us because we really enjoy talking to y'all in the chats. And if you are listening in a streaming service, that's great. Otherwise, this will drop to Spotify, iTunes, all of that stuff in the next day or two, basically whenever I get around to doing that. So I try to do it. I try to do it quickly. They're still just keeping it up late.
Mm-hmm.
Are you guys all good for nobody in our chats I don't think is from where it's flooding and all that and the western portion of the lovely state that we're in. Do you have anything worth you want to talk about?
I don't. Do I? Mm-mm.
I don't know.
No. I don't. But I do love reading about the Satanic Panic era and just how kooky everything got. But
That was that Ricky Queso case of that teenager out in the woods with those boys, and they beat that one boy to death. But in his, like, the picture of him, it's become a pretty iconic picture, and it's grabbing. If it wasn't connected in a terrible murder of a teenager, it could be a cool picture in the sense that he does look crazy. I think he was tripping though. Like, so his eyes are all like wide and I think he's wearing a Black Sabbath shirt if I'm not mistaken. And his hair's kind of curly and they're taking him in and he looks wild. But that was like the poster child picture for the idea that like these certain bands were influencing this like satanic movement and stuff. Excuse me.
Yeah. No, just that whole belief that there was all of these groups and teenagers and that they were killing and mutilating and just there's a lot of craziness. Geraldo had a special called Devil Worshipping, Exposing Satan's Underground. We had it on VHS tape. We recorded it and we would watch it. I just remember being real cheesy.
I wonder if they exposed Satan's Underground when they broke open the portal that was his nose.
Maybe. He also opened, was it Al Capone's vault?
Yeah.
And it was empty.
I'd like to knock him in the nose.
My mom was like, oh, hell. It's all that build up and we're like, there's nothing in there.
It's like,
yeah. Anyway.
All right. Well, hey, we really appreciate you guys. We love you so much. Thank you for your support. And as always, you can see these pictures and stuff on Andrea Uplate on Instagram. Go find Brian at Brian Sanders Disruptors.
Brian? Yeah, Instagram. Yeah. The easiest is the disruptors with briansanders.com.
So bad.
Or _disruptors_podcast on Instagram.
That's the one.
Yeah. And hopefully if I'm not locked out anymore, I can put up some more episodes.
That's right. He's been putting out a lot of episodes for Disruptors, but he's locked out of
Spotify somehow has locked me out of my own account. So we'll see what happens. If not, I'll be announcing a new. I don't know.
I can't keep up with another name for you, so you're keeping what you got. All right, guys, we really appreciate you guys. Thanks for tuning in, and until next, tell them good night.
Good night, everybody.
Until next time, we will see y'all next Tuesday.